this meeting to order. 9:02. And our first item is approval of the June 28th Policy Committee meeting minutes.
I move that we approve the June 28th, 2023 Policy Committee meeting minutes.
I will second that. All those in favor? All right. 1.03 public comment. Do we have any public comment? No. Then we will move right on to 1.04, Policy 114, Policy Development.
So policy 114 was brought before the committee on June 28th, was reviewed and approved by the committee to present to the board. And then in the subsequent period, I was looking at the holistic view of the policies we need to review and what the path forward is going to look like. And I came to a realization that I'm not sure that a 5-year cycle is sufficient. I think, and that's why I have brought it back to ask the committee to reconsider the 5-year and change it to a 6-year review cycle, with the 400 series being a 2-year review period. If you look at our policies, we have 18 policies in the 100 series, 9 policies in the 200 series, 21 policies in the 300 series, which after today, 7 of which maybe end up being deactivated, which would leave us 14. 35 policies in the 400 series and 13 in the 500 series. So the 400 series is far and away our biggest series and will take up the most time. If we want to be able to have meaningful review, we need time to do it. I also took a look at what other counties are doing in terms of their policy cycles, because Mr. Rose, I know that's the kind of research you like. The only website I was not able to access was Washington County's, because their site was having some difficulties. So I don't know their cycle. 11 have no specific time frame. 6 have a 3 to 4 year time, or 4 year or less time frame, and 5 have a 6, 7, or 8 year time frame, including Howard County, Baltimore City, Baltimore County, PG County, and with Montgomery County being one that does not have a dedicated cycle time. It's an ongoing, continual review. So we would be consistent with the LEAs that we are most similar to if we adopt a 6-year cycle.
Well, I think you answered our questions about how many policies were in each area. And I mean, I think this makes sense. Clearly, 3 years was not necessarily realistic. If we want the policy committee to have the dialogue, particularly when there are major changes or significant changes we want to make, I think extending the time frame makes sense. And then the thing that Dean and I were speaking about was, it's not just the work of the policy committee. All of these have to go to the board for review. Many of them will come back with at least some level of feedback and changes. The policy committee has to take that in and then come back again. And so, and we know, given our review of the 300 series right now, we've gotten through a significant chunk. Not much has gone to the board for their feedback and approval. And so I think being realistic in our policy timeframe makes the most sense to me.
I kind of appreciate the statement that you made, and I forget the exact wording that you used, but in order to make it a legitimate process,
Meaningful.
That I think that's what's important, is when you think about this policy right here, and we're making meaningful changes to this policy. But I think what the general population doesn't understand is, we don't just make these meaningful changes and then change it. This now has to go to the board for the first reading. There will probably, if there's any language changes whatsoever, it has to come back to us, make those language changes, go back for a second reading. And I think that's something that the general population doesn't understand, is how long that process can take, and then how long it can take. Say we review this now, how quickly we'll be able to get this on the agenda at a board meeting to have a meaningful discussion. Because if you look at this particular policy, there's a lot of changes in here. So we can't just carte blanche it onto the next board meeting and only allow 5 minutes, it might take a significant, and I think that's what a lot of people don't understand is we can't just arbitrarily, they look at the date at the bottom, reviewed 8 years ago.
Right.
Well, it could take us 9 months in theory to review it. First reading, get it back on the agenda, back to policy, back on the agenda. That could take several months to do it meaningful and allow other board members to have the opportunity to share their thoughts.
Even just getting through the policy committee could take several months. We have policy 314 on here for the third time, I think, third or fourth time in 4 months. Because we've had great conversation and we're making important changes to it, but that takes time.
The other question that I had was around the readings, first reading, second reading. In the consent agenda, I saw that there was some changes under the non-technical amendments section in the policy analysis area. So can you talk to us a little bit about that change?
Sure. So the current process is, as you described, once it's approved by the policy committee, it goes to the board for a first reading. They give feedback, changes are made. It goes back to the board for a second reading. The second reading is, again, information and discussion. And then it goes to a third reading, which is action consent only. It's not, unless it's pulled off of the consent as it was with policy 102, it's just an approval at the third meeting. In looking at what other LEAs do around the state, there's a variety of different approaches. Many do just 2 readings, whether it's 2 consecutive meetings or a 30-day period in between them, it is still just 2 meetings. One of the things that I identified that other LEAs were doing that we were not is this policy analysis document, where we are going to do some analysis on the front end, provide that to the policy committee and to the board. And I think with that policy analysis in place, it's going to answer a lot of the questions and it's going to help focus the conversation and make it so that a third consent reading, which is, unless it's pulled off of the consent, it's really just there, it's approved, and it's just 2 more weeks before it gets implemented, or depending on the timing, another month before it gets implemented. To me, that didn't make a whole lot of sense. And given that other LEAs use a different structure than the 3 reading approach, I thought it made sense to kind of shift to a more forward focus with the policy analysis coming on the front end.
I agree. Yep.
And I think we talked at the previous meeting, you weren't present with us, but the policy analysis edition, I think we were all impressed and appreciative of that addition to this policy. Anything else?
I had a question on, what is it, section 3, subsection E, factors.
Yes.
And we're crossing out at the discretion of the board.
We're crossing out at the direction of the board. Yes.
And then we're just saying in developing, updating, and then we're listing those, I guess, those factors.
Yes.
Is not all the factors.
Correct. And that's why it's a non-exhaustive list.
Right. So my question is, should we outline or should we clarify how policies can be brought to the policy board, policy committee, or modified out of order by the board? How the board can direct, like the understanding right now for just about any item with the board is to get 3 board members who want to put it on the agenda. So on the agenda, we have a discussion. Then if a majority, if they take a vote and 4 board members vote on any topic, but in this case, we're talking policy, 4 board members voted to, we'd like to see a review of policy 301. Then it would come to policy. Is there any reason why we would want to clarify that or put that in this particular policy?
So if you look at 3B(1), under the description of the responsibilities of the chairperson shall be responsible for developing the agenda and policy review schedule with input from the board, the committee members, and the superintendent or the superintendent's designee. That gives you the space to have the board say, hey, we want policy 100 reviewed. That gives this committee the space for you to say, hey, can you bring policy 501 for information and discussion so we can talk about it? I think that language there addresses it, but if you feel like there needs to be a more explicit statement, then I can certainly insert a more explicit statement.
I just have gotten that question not only from the public, but from fellow board members.
Right.
If I want you to review a policy, how do we go about that? And I say, get two other people to agree with you to put it on a board agenda and then bring it up for a vote. And if 4 people vote, do it. But I don't know where that's actually said, where that's actually a board policy about how that's how it happens.
I don't think it's part of policy.
Yeah, I know.
I think it's just the general powers of, if we have 3 people who want to talk about something, we're going to talk about it.
Yeah.
I mean,
I didn't know if this particular policy was an opportunity to do that.
we could certainly insert a paragraph that addresses the specifics of these are the ways a policy gets brought to the policy committee.
Yeah, I was thinking out of order or out of under whatever the language might be, just clarifying. I don't know.
Even under that section that you referenced, the little I mean, we could just say review schedule with input from a minimum of 3 board members. Just add language in there so that it's clear it has to be.
Well, I guess it would be 4. Because 3 would put it on the board agenda to say they'd have a discussion. 3 board members would come and say, okay,
Can we just do like an agenda request process?
do you want to do that?
I feel like it'll become.
I'm just saying, do you
Okay,
want
so you're-
a policy to be sent to policy and not be a consensus? Because if it's 3, that's not a consensus of the board. That's not a majority.
Yeah.
See what I'm saying?
I do.
So if we wanted to add that, my opinion would be a board majority. If you wanted to just do it that way. If we didn't want
How
to
does that
formalize it where, I agree that ties up board meeting because you put it on the agenda, then you have to have a discussion, and then could we just have a policy, part of this policy that says if 4 board members would like a policy reviewed or modified outside of the normal review period?
I wouldn't worry about it tying up too much of the board's time, honestly, because if it is a big enough issue that it has drawn the attention of the full board, it's probably already drawing taking up the board's time in some way. So I wouldn't worry too much about that.
Yep.
I
just wanted to be consistent with the other things we talk about. Like if a board member wants something on the agenda, we have that 3 people have to sign up to get it on the agenda.
So my recommendation would be to err towards the 3 individuals, not 4, and treat this more like agenda setting. Because ultimately, all the board is doing is saying, policy committee, we want you to look at this. We want this to be on your agenda. And then the agenda, then it comes to us. We do what we do here with it, and it will still get that full discussion at the board. Yeah. So I would treat it as a 3-person agenda setting type item.
Right, like a policy request.
Yeah.
Review request. Okay. I just like having that specifically outlined so that future board members know, hey, if I wanted you to review this policy, here's how I could get it done.
Absolutely. And that's an easy addition.
Okay, great.
So this policy is scheduled for the board's agenda on August 9th. So we will not have another meeting of this committee before then. I can certainly make those changes though before it has to be uploaded for public consumption.
Thank you. And I know the clean version still has the 3-year review
It does.
cycle.
It does. Oh.
listed on that. So.
Fix the clean version.
Yes. Just in.
Oh, no. No, that was showing you the current, the existing.
Oh, okay. Like, no.
Just to show you that we were going from 3 to 6, but I understand that better. You're good.
So if there's nothing else, then with that change, move this forward to the board.
Yes, yes, yes.
Okay. So that brings us then to policy 301 contract. And since we're going to bring on the 300 series, I'm just going to ask our Director of Human Resources, Julie Nguyen, to join me at the table so she can jump in where needed. So policy 301 is titled contract currently. One of the changes that we would like to make is to retitle this as employment expectations. And if you look at the existing contract or the existing policy, there is some piece of it that addresses the teacher contracts, but there are also terms in it that have nothing to do with contract, like weather closures and professional development. Those are not necessarily contract terms. And so in looking at this, we thought maybe if we reframe this as employment expectations, so employees will have an understanding of what it is we're expecting of them, which includes the having a clear contract that's consistent with what the state's expectations are for a teacher contract, which includes the understanding of what your pension is like. We did still take out the weather related item because that is addressed in another policy. It's elsewhere. And same with the transportation. That's a policy that this group has already addressed. It's in 307, I believe. So yeah, I'll turn it over to Julie and let her kind of walk you through. But that's kind of setting up why what we're trying to do with this policy.
Great. So as Mr. Billis mentioned, it was more of like a hodgepodge and we wanted to clean it up. So we put it into the new format with definitions, the policy statement, and then moved into applicability, employment terms for our contracts, which are for our certificated staff and also identifies the tenure component, both which are part of COMAR. Then we get into the teacher termination and what that process should look like. Again, that is governed by our COMAR regulations as well. Then moving into item 4 under the implementation, our assignment and classification. There were not many changes there, but we wanted to kind of header it out, make it a little easier to read. And then we get into the professionalism piece that kind of details expectations for appropriate attire, as well as funds for professional and staff development components. And then finally, the teacher assistance to principals. Again, weather closures is in another policy, so we're going to allow it to reside there. And then the items on page 4 that are crossed out, the tenure is captured in item D2. Procedure for terminating teachers is captured in item D3. And then finally, we detail the pension and retirement system.
The one thing I would like to add about the professionalism section, I know that other board members have expressed an interest in the system developing an employee code of conduct. I know that that is something that Dr. Dyson has as a goal, and this is intended to be the trigger for that. This is the direction from the board to the superintendent to establish regulations, i.e. an employee code of conduct that governs the expectations on professionalism. And then if you look at our policy 109, which we will actually look at later today, there is a section on conflicts of interest, but it is somewhat ambiguous in how it's written as to whether it only applies to board members or how it applies to employees and to what employees. And so we're looking at a clean, fresh conflict of interest policy statement that addresses things that are specific to our staff that wouldn't necessarily apply to the board. So for example, one of the policies we are going to propose to deactivate in our session today is the tutoring section. That will reside in a new conflict of interest policy. And tutoring is not something that would reside in a conflict of interest policy that applies to the board members.
Any questions?
Certainly not with my case. Unless it's on research.
I've already told you, you have a job 1 year after your.
I don't have.
Me?
Good to move this to the board?
Yeah.
I think so.
Excellent. Right, so the next policy on the agenda is policy 309, discrimination and harassment. If you look at the changes that we are proposing in this policy, I invited Dr. Harris and Dr. Artis to join me for this, but I believe they're at a training today that was mandatory, and so they were not able to be present. The changes are largely in the definitions. There really isn't a whole lot else other than inserting links to documents, which otherwise would not have been there. The links, not the documents. The changes in the definitions are intended to bring it into alignment with policy 117 and policy 444, which also address anti-racism, discrimination. You know, those are, we're just trying to bring all of the policies in alignment there.
Yeah, I mean, I guess for me, when I first opened this up, the crossing out of racism and the definition gave me some immediate pause and reaction. And then, you know, I read the additional definition, which is definitely more expansive.
Yeah, I think it's a better reflection of what those actions can really look like. I think the previous definitions we had there were very limited and didn't really align with some of our other policies.
I think this is one we just have to be prepared to discuss when it goes to the board. Because I know, as say around the anti-racism policy, there was a lot of discussion around the naming of that policy.
Mm-hmm.
Now that we're removing racism from this, while that, certainly that definition is much more expansive, and like Ms. Gallagher said, I agree. I just think we need to be prepared when it goes before the full board for a discussion.
So I will mark this as ready to move to the board. The next policy is policy 311. Policy 311 is the student teacher policy. The recommendation is to deactivate this policy, and I will let Ms. Nguyen explain why.
Right, so we're going to include it into our personnel policy 300. There were some recent legislative changes that now require us to provide student teachers and interns some additional privileges that our classroom teachers have. So we want to make sure that that new policy component in 300 details what those requirements are.
And policy 300 will be on the agenda at the
For
September 27th policy committee meeting. That's our.
We've got about 5 or 6 that we've identified will collapse into that. So, yep, we'd like to identify them as where they previously came from, so you can make sure that they're all in there before these officially go before the board for deactivation.
Policy 300 is another one of those big ones that's going to take some time to talk about, but it's because we're doing a lot with it. And you know, Ms. Gallagher, you correctly said we've not moved any of the 300 series to the board yet. Well, part of the reason we haven't moved anything to the board yet is because we need to get 300 done to tie them all together, so the board's not acting to deactivate something without something else in place.
Subsequent
Right.
policy. Right.
So it'll be like a domino. You know, we wanted to get through all of our deactivated recommendations and then bring forward what it collapses into. So that way, once that moves to the board, then the other dominoes will fall in succession.
So good to move this to the board?
Yes.
All right, so next up, policy 314, political activity, one of our favorite topics. Hopefully this will be the last time we need to go around with it. I was not here for the discussion at the last meeting, but I did watch the session several times actually. So we've proposed some changes that I think address all of the concerns that the board raised. In the definitions section, we have added a definition for what voter registration drive means. This was, there was some discussion about, does it have to be partisan or nonpartisan, or so we've provided that definition. If you jump down to D in the implementation, I collapsed the implementation into political activities on school premises, with the first section being what is permissible and the second section being what is impermissible. Previously, they were two standalone sections, but I've collapsed them into one place because they seem to fit together, and I wanted the structure of each to kind of mirror the other. There are a few changes to these items. So if you look at on school the permissible activities, if you look in little 2, we've added the or to discuss significant current events as a permissible activity, because there is so much that has been going on in our world in the last 5, 10, 15 years that you could very easily run afoul of a policy just by starting to talk about having a general discussion, not necessarily instructional, but having a just discussion about George Floyd or Breonna Taylor or whatever else has been going on recently that is charged. And I wanted to make it clear that that's permitted, that we want to be able to have those conversations. The other change in here is under the impermissible list. And you will see that I've added that voter registration drives are impermissible unless they are pre-approved by the deputy superintendent. We're not saying we don't want voter registration drives. We're saying we want to make sure we're controlling when they're happening and how often they're happening and where they're happening. So we're not creating a burden on the system. And so by making it an impermissible act to do it on your own, but permissible if you do it with the deputy superintendent's permission, I think we maintain those controls. The voter registration activities section got a fairly significant overhaul. The first section describes, again, that you need the prior written approval of the deputy superintendent. It provides guidance as to what information we're looking for, the schedule of the dates that you want to do it, the school where you want to do the registration and drive at, what times, who will be attending. It also provides some guidance as to, well, what are the factors the deputy superintendent is going to consider in deciding whether to grant or reject it. The number of drives held that year, the disruption that it will have to the operations, whether it is a partisan with other partisan groups invited to participate. And that's reflective of what was previously or now is reflected in the D that's struck through. That's there to reflect that we, looking at whether there was, bipartisan approach for this, for the voter registration drive. We also included or we're recommending language that clarifies what materials may be distributed, that you can distribute the materials to vote, the registration materials, but we're not going to permit you to pass out candidate flyers, political issue flyers, political party flyers. That's not the purpose of a voter registration drive. Voter registration drive is there to get people registered so they can vote. The changes in F are just, textual. They're not substantive. It doesn't change. We've always wanted them to come to central office for voter registration, not directly contact principals. And then one of the things that I did here when I was listening back was the interest in maybe having a space on the FCPS website for voter registration information. And so this authorizes the superintendent in her discretion to create a page that is nonpartisan that provides voter registration information. This gives the direction to the superintendent that if that's something she wants, that the board is supportive of that. If you go down into the use of FCPS facilities for political activities and you go into B, we've proposed some revisions that address that try and clarify the signs, where they, when they can be posted and when they have to come down. It previously only referenced election, but as we know, we have early voting, and so putting signs up in connection with early voting, but making sure that they're taken down within 24 hours seemed like a reasonable approach to the early voting, so they're not just sitting there up for however many months between when the early voting is and when the general election voting day is. So those are the changes that we are proposing with respect to political activity on this go round. Questions?
I think they're pretty comprehensive. You picked up on a lot from the discussion from the last time, so thank you. My only question is back to the signs. Early voting, got it. Election day, got it. Placement of ballot boxes, which tend to be, I think, 30 days prior to election day. I'm not sure that that's captured in here, unless, give me your interpretation of how that
It,
might be.
I think it's captured by omission. And I say that because no one's going to the ballot drop box with an unfilled out ballot. They have filled out their ballot before they get there. To me, in my eyes, it's very, how is it any different than a post, the little blue, mailbox where, you're not sitting there writing your letter, licking your stamp, sealing the envelope. You've done that. You're just walking up, dropping it in and leaving. There's really no purpose from that perspective to having signs around a drop box if the voting is already effectively done. So that's so it's there by omission, but we can incorporate a clear statement that signs will not be permitted except as indicated on a voting day, in-person voting days.
I would, thinking like candidates think, I would, because the drop boxes are there for as long as maybe 30 days.
Mhm.
Right? And candidates think there won't just be people who are coming to drop off their ballot driving by that box every day. There will be people.
Mhm.
And I fear that someone will see that omission and they'll post a sign. So
I mean, I think the addition of maybe in-person voting,
Mhm.
early voting and election day, that should clarify. Although
Yeah.
people still might say you're in person.
It's not a hard thing to put in another sentence that says, something to the effect of signs are not permitted around voting drop boxes. They're only permitted on, at the
are
time
we
of the.
designated early voting or voting election day?
That's an easy
Yeah,
adjustment that we
let's
can
do
make.
that. 'Cause that way it takes away all argument.
Yeah.
And I have one, I hope, quick question around D. 1A II.
Mhm.
It says instructional activities where issues or political events are discussed as part of a broad-based instructional format or to discuss significant current events. Okay, so that enables them to have open discussion. But then under B, II, it says discussing opinions with students regarding a political candidate or ballot proposition unless the topic is part of an approved curriculum.
Mhm.
I just wonder if those are counter to one another without some more specific language. Because I get where we're headed with BII, is it's regarding a political candidate or ballot proposition on the ballot.
Right.
I just worry about we get into the discussion like the first one says, significant current events, and say we're talking about a presidential election, not local, but a
Mhm.
presidential election, and students start a discussion. I worry about them running afoul of BII. Does that make sense?
It does. And I do, I agree that there is, I think, a distinction between bringing up political candidates who are on the ballot or political issues that are addressed as a ballot initiative versus just a general conversation about things going on in the world today. But I do see how there could be potential for conflict. I'm not sure sitting here that I'm prepared to give opinion one way or the other. I don't know if Dr. Cuppet has an opinion. He wasn't called upon for this. He's here for a later session, but I'll take advantage of his presence.
Yeah, because I brought this up because I've heard this from teachers that are talking about political science or history, and it evolves into say the current presidential election.
Good.
And then they fear that they're running afoul of
Sure. teachers would have concerns that they are
Yes.
getting into that political activity area, right?
Yes.
So we do provide guidance, and I guess I want to just briefly look at, is there a change here, or are we?
The change we're proposing is to add or to discuss significant current events. Otherwise, the black text is existing.
Okay, so what we're saying is
We're
do
giving
want-
them permission to discuss
Correct.
significant current events, but then under BII, it's always said basically not to talk about a political candidate or ballot proposition.
as far as personal opinion.
Unless it's already on an approved curriculum.
Right, so the way it's currently written, if you don't insert the or to discuss significant current events, it's approved if it's curriculum based, if it's instructional.
Yeah.
And it's not approved unless it's instructional. We're the question I guess is, are we opening the door by saying or to discuss significant current events which isn't necessarily tied to instruction in a way that makes B2 a conflict?
I know this is a really difficult
But we
for our
have other
teachers.
policies that address instructional discussions that might relate to this. So-
Yeah, so I think the easiest way to think about this is, let's go to a practical example. So if we're teaching in our government course and we're teaching about separation of powers and a current event, because we do want students to apply what they're learning in a government class to what exists in their context. Let's say we're doing separation of powers, we're doing checks and balances, and they go to something related specifically right now in the Supreme Court. I could see a student easily bringing up the overturning of Roe v. Wade. What we ask our teachers to do and what we give them guidance about is, okay, this is a place where we can engage students in a conversation. Students can certainly say they don't think it should have been overturned or they should have been, but the teacher themselves is to not insert their personal opinions or their political view of that, right? And so we, in fact, Mr. Murphy and Dr. Gall and I were talking this morning, we provide guidance every year on teaching of potentially controversial topics. And we do that by content area. So what Dr. Bernard gives her teachers in social studies, it's always about keeping this fair and balanced approach in the sense that we don't insert our own opinions. And we certainly also want to make sure that the classroom environment doesn't become an argument, right? We don't want students arguing, but rather learning to have discourse or debate, which is a bit of a lost art in our society in many ways. And so we were just talking that we provide that guidance to teachers annually by content area. So how might this come up in an English course or in a career and technical course? The one thing I always caution the public and the board about is you would be amazed at what students bring up in class. And we have very well-educated, thoughtful young men and women, especially in our high schools, that are not afraid to bring up topics and say, hey, why can't we talk about this? We want our education system to be relevant to students. So a lot of this comes out in that particular area. Now, I do believe to some of the earlier discussion I heard that certainly they might bring up things related to local elections, Board of Education candidates, county executive. Many of our students are very politically savvy because maybe they have a politically savvy household or a politically active household. The same would apply there. The teacher would then be about whether, one, should we engage in this particular conversation based on the content we're covering today? Should we put a pin in that conversation? You know, we're going to talk about such and such in 2 weeks. Let's revisit this conversation there. And then ensuring that the classroom remains civil and appropriate and that they keep their own teacher personal opinions out. So I think, and we've done a lot of work with our teachers over the last probably 4 or 5 years, maybe even more, maybe 6 or 7 years, because of what students were seeing in the political discourse and the 24-hour news cycle and, you know, the campaigns at various levels. So I think the goal here is to continue to equip and train teachers to manage these conversations. And I appreciate that we're saying that you can have those, but here are kind of the guidelines. And I think that's very important for our teachers.
Thank you. I
Yeah.
really appreciate your
Yeah,
stepping
thank
in
you.
unannounced or unplanned.
That's very helpful, thank you.
Yeah.
So that gives you comfort on that insertion? Any other questions on 314, or do we think this is finally ready for advancing to the board? Subject to that one articulation.
Advanced.
Subject to that one articulation about the Dropbox stuff,
Yes. Yes.
which will also be a robust discussion, no doubt.
Sure.
The next item on the agenda is policy 315, tutoring educational services offered by FCPS staff. As I had previously indicated, the recommendation here is to deactivate this policy. The intention is that we will be creating a conflict of interest policy that will address this and other topics. Ms. Nguyen, if you want to expound upon?
Covered it.
Agreed.
And that'll be a separate 300
Correct.
series policy that will be developed.
The next one, policy 320, support personnel. This is again another recommended deactivation because we are going to incorporate the content into the new, very robust policy 300.
Yes.
And then I think my notes have them out before. So the next two items, policy 109 and policy 501, are both on the agenda for information and discussion. I know that the policy 109 had previously been in front of the committee maybe in January, in the transition in me into the role, I think that work may have gotten somewhat lost. So the information and discussion may be as simple as telling me what it was you wanted done back then, so I can go ahead and do it for you.
Yes. It actually got to the board in February.
Oh,
Yes. And there was some vigorous discussion around in the one part in particular about the 1 year. So, but yeah, I think it's time to get this one cleaned up, get it done, put it to bed.
okay. So the 1 year.
So in particular, it's under D3.
Where are we
That was
going?
the area,
Are we going straight to the 1 year thing?
unless you had other things. I actually did.
So I had
read this.
I had
There were
indicated
other
I had
things.
indicated that I thought there were some other changes
Yeah.
that need to be made, and
Why
I
don't
was
we let you start and let's.
well. So funny thing, I remember thinking about that there are things in this that need to be changed, and I don't know where I wrote down what it was. So I need to pour through this again to figure
Okay.
out what it was. But some of what we talked about today, though, I think the fact that we're creating a separate conflict of interest policy for employees may mean that this needs to be revised just to clarify that this is a conflict of interest policy as it applies to the board. So there are going to be changes, I think, that relate to that as well.
Okay, because that's actually my notes here, is under 109.3, is there seems to be a lot of language in there that may or may not be legal. I mean, particularly when you get down to D and we get down to post-employment, that what power do we have to tell a former official or board member what they can or can't do once they leave the board? Yes, they can't come right now. They can't come to work for FCPS, but what power do we have to tell them they can't go take a job? Their choice.
That was one of the others.
So, yeah, so I'm particularly concerned about that whole section of post-employment restrictions. And then, of course, the discussion surrounding the 1 year issue.
So I will say that 109 is a special and unique policy because the changes we make also need to be submitted to the state because of the rules that govern changes to our ethics policy. So this one we may want to do this in chunks. Is what I'm saying, is maybe if we're just looking at we want to do just the 1 year piece first and then look at the broader changes, it may be in our interest to do it chunk it that way. as opposed to trying to do a full change
Yeah.
that we still would have to submit to the state
Yes.
for review.
And maybe those are state laws and regulations and COMAR that needs to be cited under here that does control
Right.
activities post employment. So,
We had some questions in the lobbying section as well, which is 9.9. So, but I'm on board with us looking at it in chunks and maybe doing deeper digging on some revisions.
So I will put this back on our agenda for the September 27th. And it will either be information and discussion just to update you on what my research has told me about what can and cannot be done. Or it may be action if there are changes that we can make and with guidance as to what the process is for making those changes.
and while we're doing that, since I'm new, from what I've heard and what's true, and can we have some discussion around the part of the policy that brought so much activity for the previous board about the 1 year wait?
Oh, right now, absolutely.
I mean, I just,
Yeah, no, that's why we're here.
one, my understanding is we were the only LEA that has that language. Just, that was what I heard. And that, and again, you're working on innuendo and rumor, is that that language was applied years and years and years ago because it happened. Somebody was upset that a board member left the board and took a position within FCPS at a level. So would it be appropriate to designate, like board members have brought up, is this saying that I couldn't go drive a bus or I couldn't be a substitute teacher, or in my case, go back to coaching? That, because I don't see any ethical problem with that. I frankly don't see any problem with if a board member had the education and wanted to go back to teaching. Frankly, don't have a problem with that. I do get it that if board members somehow use their power to influence people and end up on a cabinet position or a principal, so can we do that? Can we do specific language that, that allows us to address situations where I think it's to the benefit of our district, that we need bus drivers, we're always looking for coaches, as well, teachers.
Sure.
Can we not be specific?
I can certainly research the question, and if it is something that is permitted, I can either bring that back and we can talk about, well, where do you want to draw that distinction, or I can just propose a recommendation for where we draw the distinction, and then we can adjust based on that recommendation.
Yeah, and just because of the timing, we've had a lot of feedback that's saying the 1 year is really 2 because of our interviewing and hiring processes, that it really kicks somebody out.
Right.
And the term of a board member ends in November, which is not aligned with where our hiring.
You're basically out 18 months because by the time you've satisfied the year, you're then not being hired until the start of the following year, most likely.
Correct. Correct. So, but yes, let's, like I said, possibly this, as much as I want to get this one put behind us, it probably needs a lot of attention. And like you suggested, take it in chunks. And
other things that the committee would like me to focus on in terms of what we're looking at for providing clarification, enhancement, change.
Not for me. I think the lobbying section was one that I had some questions about. And then the 1 year timeframe. And I'm glad we're going to separate out the board from other employees, because that got a little confusing.
Yep.
I'm good
Yeah.
with that.
me too.
And then that brings us to our last policy that's on the agenda. Again, this is for information and discussion. It's 501 curriculum distribution. And I will invite Dr. Puppet and his team to join us back up here because they are going to be your subject matter experts.
Good morning. Thank you all for coming.
Glad to be here. So just a matter of quick introductions, and for anybody watching at home, I'm Kevin Cuppin. I'm the Chief Academic Officer. This is Dr. Kathy Gall. She's one of our directors of curriculum. That's Mr. Scott Murphy. He is our other director of curriculum. So you have all three of us.
Great. You ready? Go ahead. You want to start? I have a general question.
Yes.
Do we need, in order to initiate regulation change,
Uh-huh.
do we need to, is there changes to 501 that need to happen?
No,
So
not necessarily.
Okay.
It depends on, I would say, what direction or detail you think should be in policy 501 that would maybe impact regulation. So it might be helpful for you to kind of talk about how do we in the business of curriculum take action based on 501. So if you want, I can just give you a quick walkthrough of that. Okay. So 501, as you can see, it's not an extensive, long policy, but there's a lot of substance to it. And what happens is that either manifests itself as a regulation, which are updated on a regular basis, or into some types of standard operating procedures. So let's talk about one of the big chunks. So out of policy 501 comes regulation 500-38, which is our textbook review, selection, and approval process. This is an extensive regulation that outlines a process that we in curriculum follow. I'll just story it out by example because I think that's the easiest way to think about it. It's time for a new math curriculum at the elementary level. This regulation takes the curriculum specialist and helps them identify what type of textbook or resource is this by classification. And depending on the level of that textbook, you'll see in the regulation that it requires a certain committee to be put together, a certain number of experts. It could include teachers, maybe somebody in the community that's an expert in the area, parents, etc. They go through a very specific review process where they look at a number of programs or vendors, and they evaluate those based on a set of criteria. And those criteria can be very general. So from an equity perspective, we look at all of our textbooks for representation of our students. That's just one example. Do we treat topics in a fair and balanced way? All the way through to very content-specific things. In elementary mathematics, we might be looking at how does the text publisher represent number and have kids represent number, because how they represent number ties to the way our state standards look and our assessments at the state level. So we don't want to present a textbook to students that doesn't have them have the mathematical experience that we're going to assess them on. It's kind of not fair. So we go through this process, they narrow it down, they make a selection. That selection is then sent in a form to Dr. Marco, and it comes to you all on consent agenda, and you can sign off on that textbook. So we have primary level textbooks, which are big, they're running the whole show. We have some supplemental textbooks that sometimes happen. I can give you an example. If we have a government textbook, would go through the full process. Let's say we decided that we wanted to have a small supplemental text in there. It doesn't drive the whole program, so to speak, but we want to have that available for teachers. That's a less significant process to go through because it is not the flagship textbook, so to speak. And so there's a process outlined in this regulation for that. And those would come forward for board approval, although it just didn't have maybe as large a committee that was put together. It might have even been a curriculum specialist and a teacher. So textbook review, selection, approval is the vast majority of materials that come to the board come through that regulation. Then there's a regulation around curriculum and courses. Okay, so this is every year, usually it's usually in the month of March. You spent time on C&I committee. Our specialists will come through and let the board know, are there any changes in any standards? So for instance, when we moved to the Maryland College and Career Ready standards. It was called Common Core at the time, back in the day. We brought those standards forward to the board. We brought next generation science standards. We brought new health frameworks, et cetera. Those standards always come to the board via the C&I committee and then into consent for the board. We also do it with new courses or pilot courses. Not too long ago, we piloted the 9/11 to the present course at Linganore High School. And it was what we realized as students, all the students that were sitting in our schools were born before 9/11. And so Mr. Hornbeck and the curriculum specialist at the time developed a course that the course standards came to the board. And then if there was going to be a flagship textbook for that, it would come forward for approval. We did not do that with that course. There wasn't a good textbook for 9/11 to the present. But there were a lot of resources and original source materials that were used. And so those courses, whether they're pilot, whether they're proposed as new automatically, or whether they're going to be discontinued, that always comes to the board, and the board will make decisions on that. And so that's Regulation 500-35. In addition, as you're aware, sometimes somebody has a concern with a book that we may have, whether it's they don't like something that's in a textbook, they don't like a supplemental material. We will sometimes have parents express a concern to the teacher. I don't like this particular novel that my child has been assigned. 99% of those are resolved by the fact that we say, okay, our goal is to teach a standard, and let's say literary standard. You don't need this novel to do that. We can do that with this novel over here. So an alternative assignment is provided to the student, and that resolves a lot of issues. But sometimes there could be a formal request. And so we have Regulation 500-39. That is a reconsideration of instructional materials already in use. And that is a formal process where a citizen, it could be a citizen, it could be a parent, who has a concern, and we engage in a process that is stepped out and very clear as to how we respond to that. We're currently in a request for reconsideration based on the concerns that were submitted by some citizens. And so we have a process to review that, which is part of good practice, and pretty much I don't know any school district that doesn't have a procedure for that. And then occasionally things have come up through the years that haven't been placed in regulation, but have been placed in this kind of unusual space called like a standard operating procedure. But there was actually a set of standard operating procedures that were approved by a previous board, and this became known as the Pink Booklet. Now, the last time we actually physically printed the Pink Booklet was in 2007. So this is what we call an archive copy. So the one I have in front of me here, it was really around for nostalgia's sake, but it has been helpful for us to say that there have been other things that have been approved by the board, but have not been placed in policy, nor were they placed in regulation. But it's like many other departments. Human Resources has a set of standard operating procedures. It's just the board had a little more oversight in what went into the Pink Booklet. So I'll give you an example of something that's in the Pink Booklet. Policy 501 is in the Pink Booklet. The textbook selection and approval regulation is in the Pink Booklet. The reconsideration process is in the Pink Booklet. But then they went on to find some other areas. And so there are some things related to criteria that they felt that the textbook committee should be looking at. And they're similar criteria to what we use in that process. Even though those criteria are not explicitly outlined in the regulation, we had them as kind of backup in the Pink Booklet. Another area that became an area where the board, I think, and I don't have all the history on this, but maybe wanted to provide some additional guidance was in the selection of drama productions, plays at the high school. Let's make sure that they had some guidance that when we go to select these plays, you have some criteria and information. Criteria for library media materials, and this is where we had shared, and part of our FAQ related to the most recent reconsideration request is around like how do library materials get selected. And so we have there's general criteria about all of our instructional materials, but specifically that positive review from one of these authoritative bibliographic sources or review journals. So that's here in the Pink Booklet. There's also some criteria for career education materials. For example, number 2, absence of any sex role stereotyping, racial discrimination, or occupational denigration. So we don't want to buy materials in our career or anywhere in our curriculum where it only shows women as nurses and only shows men as doctors, right? Those kind of antiquated imagery that you would often have in education materials, because culturally that's where those materials were in the past. So it goes through a variety of things for career education material. There's no regulation about that per se, but these things do provide us guidance. And so as we move our way down through, and by the way, there are a bunch of things that we do that are good practice that are informed by other things. So right now there's been a release of, I can't remember if it's Senate or House bill, we call it 7-910, which is the new accessibility law in the state of Maryland. We'll be reporting on the accessibility of all of our digital tools. There's nothing in our regulations about that, but we do, as a matter of good practice, apply accessibility information to our selection. So one of the edits you'll probably see coming up in textbook review, selection, and approval is inclusion information around accessibility requirements under Maryland Law 7-910. So those things happen all the time in curriculum, where we have to be pretty nimble with what's occurring in the, either coming from the law or MSDE guidance or something like that. And so there's some supplemental forms here in the back around software evaluation process. I will tell you that our software evaluation process has considerably changed since 2007. It's much more thorough. It involves more people. Right now, if you want to get a piece of software approved in FCPS, it has no more than, I think, about 9 or 10 stops that it takes, whether it's Department of Technology Infrastructure with our student information system, because there are a lot of changes in student data privacy laws. And so in order to be in compliance with all that, we have to have a lot of people sign off. And so the way software got approved back in 2007 in this archive document is not even close to how thorough we are now. And some of that is reflected in regulation and portions of regulations, and others it's just good practice to what we do. So that being said, that's kind of how it all goes downhill from policy. So Mr. Rose, I guess my question would be does the board have interest in any regulation changes that they feel based on their experience as board members that would need to occur?
Some board members.
I can speak for myself personally.
Do you have a sense, thank you for that.
Sure.
I think there's obviously a lot of moving pieces that go into all of these decisions within the school system. Do you have a sense of how much time and or system resources have gone into the current book reconsideration process that we are engaged in?
Time or system use? Well, let me describe what the work has been. At the time, Dr. Gall was not on board with us. So Mr. Murphy and I spearheaded the work. So there was, I don't know, probably 5 to 6 hours of shepherding, making sure that the process was followed to the T, including Dr. Marco notifying the complainants that the complaint had been received, and an initial meeting that Mr. Murphy and I had with 2 of the 3 complainants. One complainant declined to come in for the meeting. And then there was probably, I don't know, 15 to 20 hours between myself, Mr. Murphy, and our 2 executive assistants to prep for the soliciting the community for committee members. And then there was a review process, and then our data team did random selection. Then we eventually had to notify people that they were a part of the committee. We've had now 6 meetings that last a little under two hours probably. On those committees are a number of teachers, curriculum specialists, media specialists, school administrators. Try to make sure I have all the groups. Those are the school-based staff. There are community members, parents, and students as well. Did I miss anybody, Scott? I think we got them. Okay. I've been living it. Yeah. So there is preparation for before those meetings. There's follow-up after the meetings. In addition, we have started to move on to the final report. There's a final report that needs to be produced for the deputy superintendent. Based on the number of books, it is going to be a very extensive report. So Dr. Marco wisely saw that the number of books that we were reviewing, the last time we did this, we reviewed one book. The number of books, there's some latitude within the regulation that he can, because of circumstances, unusual circumstances, can extend some of the timelines. So he gave us additional time to write the report, which I anticipate will probably be upwards to 150 pages, I guess, when it's all said and done, probably. And so what we did is we didn't want Dr. Cuppet to write the report. I'm trying to facilitate that. Scott and I serve as facilitators, not necessarily committee members per se. And so we then have now received from the group volunteers from the teacher, administrator, specialist, student, community member, parent group to be co-authors of this report. And so I'm meeting periodically with that group to say who's going to work on this section, who's going to work on this section based on the, all of that involves significant intensive note-taking, which will all be available in the final report. So this particular request for reconsideration, I think, has been very resource intensive, but I also think it's been good work. The committee has taken the work very seriously. The level of conversation that Mr. Murphy and I will kind of move between groups just to make sure we're not stuck on any process things. It has been very high level. It's been amazingly civil. It has been the kind of discourse that you think is part of the exercise of our democratic rights and democratic processes. And complainants have sometimes provided verbal or written testimony, or sometimes both. And there's been lots of opportunities for complainants to do that. That being said, I think the good work of the committee is important because in this regulation, it does allow for what we call in-principle decisions, which means that, let's say the report is submitted, goes through the process, and 6 months from now, somebody has another library book that they don't like, and they submit a request for reconsideration. If we feel that this book, upon review and reading of the text, is like one of the books that this committee has already dealt with, that we can use the decision for that the previous book is almost like a precedent, and say that in principle, the decision has already been made. Your complaint for this book is similar to the complaint of a book that we've already handled. This is how we handled it there. And then we can offer to Dr. Marco that we have an in-principle decision here. And then, and if he agrees with that and passes it on to Dr. Dyson, our school superintendent, then the committee is not convened at that point. So in some ways, the resource-intensive work we're doing now may set a number of in-principle decisions that could allow for a more expedited review of a citizen or a parent's concern in the future. So yeah, it's been a significant number of hours.
And I guess also as part of this process, we set some precedent that this process, I mean, I appreciate your explanation of if there's one book that comes in its significant. Let's say this book reconsideration committee process is concluded, we have the report, and then we receive another complaint of additional 32 books or materials.
Yes.
And have we set some precedent that we are going to continue to engage in this resource-intensive process?
Yeah.
Each time, and if there's a significant number again of materials that are presented with concerns.
So I think if we were presented with another 32 books, right, we would need to assign resource according to the regulation. We would need to determine if we feel it's an in-principle decision. That would be the first step. So we, and our responsibility and the responsibility committee is we have committed to reading the books in their entirety. And so we would have to assign some people to read it to say, let's go through and look at the previous decision and feel like that lines up, and whether we can state in our submittal to Dr. Marco that here's the book we have concerns with. Here's why the complainant has concern. The book was reviewed by whatever, 2 people. We feel that this book is very similar to this category of books from our previous, and we feel that there's an in-principle decision that this does not, for instance, does not like violate any of the prongs of the Miller test, which is what we're using, because the concern or complaint about a book might be that it's obscene or pornographic. And so we're using the Miller test as associated with that, because that's what the U.S. Department of Justice says courts do use. So we would look at that, and if we came to the conclusion that we feel it's in principle, that's what we'd submit to Dr. Marco for his consideration. Now, would we have to do that for all 32 books? Yes, I believe we would. Now, would we decide to convene a committee? Perhaps if there was a concern about one of the books that was different and we didn't feel we had an in-principle decision, then yes, we would go about convening a committee to do that, because that's what the regulation states. And so I'll give you an example of one where we might very well put a committee together. We might have a citizen who has a concern, not about a library book, because library books are dealt with very differently than curriculum materials. And that's the courts have ruled on that for years, right? The whole different kind of set of case law. Some overlap, but very different contexts where students access materials. In curriculum, it's a captive audience. You're getting what you get. Library, there's choice, right? So very different environments. But let's just say somebody had a concern about, I don't know, a new social studies text that we were using in the elementary level. And they may have a concern about how a particular section of that book, and by the way, the previous request for reconsideration we had before the current one we're in was around a social studies text, grade 3. So we might go ahead and convene a group at that point. However, we would go back and look at the previous social studies text concern, and we might have an in-principle decision for the new social studies text, but we may not. And if we don't feel we can justify that fairly, then we would convene that committee of 11. Now, we're pretty good at this work right now after a lot of practice. So my assumption would be that we would convene a committee and be able to review a single book in a really expedited way. We have all of these processes are all now written down, and kind of the documents that we use that we've created for this, they're all here. So that would go much more quickly, probably 2 meetings at most. And then a report could be generated, my guess is within the original timeline in the regulation, which I can't remember how many days off the top of my head, but we wouldn't need extensions of time for a single book, I don't think.
Well, my first question is, as you've gone through this process, is it in your mind, or has it begun to elicit any changes to the standard operating procedures?
So I'm going to ask a question for you didn't ask. Let me deal with this one first. We actually do have some recommendations for the request for reconsideration of all materials already in use reg. There's a couple of things in here where I don't think the language around timelines is as clear. So we probably will be bringing back some minor edits to Dr. Dyson about timeline related things. That being said, in other areas that 501 governs, like our standard operating procedures, actually Dr. Gall and Mr. Murphy and I have had a couple of conversations about, you know what, there probably are some things here that should be brought out into regulation, and could either adjust our curriculum and courses regulation or textbook approval, but that we might actually need to look at regulations specific to, for instance, drama selection of plays. Wouldn't be a very long regulation, but bringing it into regulation, I think it brings it, it's more transparent for the public, and it kind of raises the level in a lot of people's minds. So that would be a regulation. Then once we put it into effect, if Dr. Dyson were to agree and approve that, then that would be something that our curriculum specialists and our school administrators would have to guide their work directly with our teachers of drama and theater, right? So we do have a couple ideas around that. Our goal is to make sure that if we are going to do regulation work, it has to be done in the context of Policy 117, which we're making a lot of adjustments to regulations right now because of Policy 117. Want to make sure it aligns with 444. If it's appropriate, 443 or any other policy that we have. And so some of these SOPs have maybe not looked at in that way. We don't think any of them are out of line with policy, but when you go to write that regulation, you want to be able to cross-reference those policies so that you as a board can see our thinking and how it follows your direction. In addition, we might want to do some work where the actual SOPs themselves are revised or updated. We've kept up with the book. We did make changes since 2007, but that is something that we are going to do, and we're in the process of doing anyway because of, like I said, 7, 9, 10, the law around accessibility has to go into our textbook regulation. It's going to have to go over anywhere we have digital tools referred to, and so we'll have to crosswalk that. So there can be some adjustments or changes, I think, that we can make based not only on the questions and concerns that have come up, whether it's in regard to reconsideration, but just the changing of the textbook environment. You've noticed that we've made changes to that regulation over time. There's lots of things that we feel we need to respond to. And we had a discussion this morning in preparation for this meeting about some places that we thought we could go from a regulation perspective.
I guess specifically for the public, will the results of this current reconsideration process impact our standard operating procedure for the selection of library materials?
At this time, we don't have a change that we've anticipated related to selection of library materials. Is there something in particular that you think we should look at?
I don't know what the results of the process are.
Oh, yeah.
I'm saying when the report is complete,
Yes.
do we anticipate, based on the results of that report, we'll go back and make some changes to our standard operating procedures as how we select library books?
I think it's premature for me to answer that
I
because
mean, I guess that is a premature, it's a question to ask
Yeah.
when the report's presented to
Yeah.
us.
right.
Will this impact our standard operating procedure? I mean, I guess I'm just using a hypothetical that
Yeah.
if 5 of those books are chosen not to be appropriate for a school library,
Right.
might we need to change
Yeah.
our standard operating procedure
Sure.
of how those books got selected in the first place?
I think that's a great question. I think once we have an outcome on that, we should be able to provide some additional information.
Keep going? Okay. 501 coming from us is extremely broad.
Yeah.
Obviously.
Sure. Mhm.
So not wondering, I'm interested in providing some direction for, Regulation 539, as far as what it takes to bring a book
Uh-huh.
forward
Okay.
for reconsideration.
All right.
Personally, I think one person is not financially, socially, community responsible that one person can file a reconsideration for 35 books or 100 books
Sure.
or however many books and force this motion that costs the community both financially and time-wise and may not have any connection, because our regulation is very broad, that if a person feels they're uncomfortable with this textbook or this material
Mhm.
previously approved, it just takes one.
Yeah.
I don't personally think that's appropriate. So that's why I asked that first question, is that do we need to make a change to 501 in order to force a change to the regulation? Let's just use an example to say that we'd like to see a minimum of 10 people sign off in order to force reconsideration of it.
So I will tell you, historically, we'd have to go back way into the records, but my recollection as the principal who served on the last reconsideration committee, when we reviewed social studies text, I think the threshold was 6. Don't quote me for, I'm not laying $1,000 on that, but I'd lay $3 on it that I think it was 6. And so the question is this: if I'm concerned about a text and I fill out the form, how easy is it for me to say, hey, remember that text I was talking about the other day at soccer game? Can you fill out one of these too? How long does it take before that threshold's met by simply, because if I recall, and we could go into the record, when we reviewed the complainant's submittals, they were identical. The text was the same. And you see a very similar pattern in the 3 submittals that we've had for this, right? So there's a lot of common language. So certainly I do think, and I've heard personally from people that, wow, we're putting a lot of resources out because a couple of people were concerned about books. Okay, I get that sentiment, and the stewards of taxpayer dollars and so on and so forth. But I think it's very important to remember that when somebody takes the step of putting forward a complaint like this, it is a sincerely held belief that they have, that they do feel that these are problematic for whatever reasons. Now, whether the mass of citizens agree with them or whether they have friends that do or don't, for us as the school district, my goal was to make sure that those complaints were heard, that the committee fully understood them, and that we then used not only the concerns of the complainant in our analysis, but the legal tenets, right? That we really apply what the law has said and what the regulations said. So certainly putting a threshold of 10 in is an option that we could have. My guess is, and I wasn't here when the conversation occurred, that the threshold of 6 is probably easy for a complainant to get to, and is that an unnecessary bureaucratic hoop for them? I don't know. That might have been the debate or the discussion, but I know now that threshold of 6 is not in there. So that's kind of my personal opinion. Scott, I don't know if you have anything you wanted to.
Yeah, the other thing that comes to mind really was said earlier around timeline. Is another way to maybe have some controls in place. I think, as was shared, the last reconsideration request was several years ago. It was 1 book. This process is important for us in the community to go through. It always yields the right results, and through an open democratic process. To have 36 at one time, however, it's almost impossible to get it done within a reasonable time frame. So what is reasonable? And I think that's part of what we're learning is we got it done in just a few months. But for that to be replicated in the future, should things happen again, I think we could maybe consider some controls on timeline, which we may have some ideas around the regulation once we get through the process. In my experience too, in other districts, as a principal and as a curriculum director, it was always like 1 or 2 a year, which is very reasonable, process in place to do that, and it's important. But there is a threshold with which it just becomes really difficult to pull off, as you alluded to.
And as anyone can attest, I've researched, and there's a lot of districts examining their.
Oh, absolutely.
review.
We are not in this alone.
Right, we're not in this alone. And I just look at like you just recounted the amount of time and effort that was put on, not just by you folks, but our community members, teachers, media specialists. And it gives me pause in our current environment that one person can fill out and list 30 books. That gives me pause.
Right.
And that's why I asked the other question is, will this and maybe again, this is a discussion we'll have to have when the final report comes out, is will this elicit changes to both our selection process and possibly our checkout process at our libraries, or should we split out the difference between a reconsideration of a book and a request for an alternate book? Like you outlined where they can do that. I can see that as a parent.
Sure.
If I had a problem with a book that my child was assigned, I see that as being a different issue. You mentioned that's request for an alternate text.
Sure.
I think that should be one person. I understand that. But we're talking about a mass library. I think we should already be charged in our standing operation rating procedures that we do our best to make sure they're age appropriate, they're appropriate for both educational and entertainment. We mentioned that in here for entertainment purposes, social purposes. So I guess a lot of this discussion is going to have to wait until the final report comes out. I'll certainly be one of the ones that signs off on a full discussion as a board to talk about what we can do to both 501 and maybe
Yeah.
initiate some changes to some of our regulations. I appreciate the part about principle, but in principle, we've already
Yeah.
decided.
Mhm.
I think we should support you all in that decision if that ever comes before us.
Well, and one of the things that I've shared, and I think this is kind of food for thought as you as policymakers, as board members. If we're purchasing somewhere between 10 and 12,000 titles across the district per year, that's a lot of books. When it's all said and done, I'll use your hypothetical that a book is decided to not be appropriate. Let's just say in the view of the critics, that's a mistake. That's an error. Well, your error rate's pretty low based on our current process. If we did in fact remove, I say, a single book from the entire collection, because only so many of those books created a concern, right? And then they were reviewed, and ultimately, if a minority of those books are removed from it, then in some ways, I would say that the process is working pretty well, because there are 12,000. We currently have a little under 300,000 titles in our libraries, which is when the court said, the library is that great marketplace of ideas. You got to have a lot of books to have a lot of ideas. And so I think we need to think about that in context of, what would be, I was talking with Scott and Kathy this morning. I said, nobody gets too fired up about the informational text in second grade about the frog life cycle, right? It's tadpoles and this and that. And so we don't expect that the vast majority of the books would even come close to being controversial. But I do tell my friends outside of education, you'd be surprised what somebody thinks is controversial when you may not. You may look at a book and go, I don't see anything problem with that book. Because different people have so many different views about things. We might look at a book and say it's great, and Scott might say, I don't think this is appropriate. And you're like, well, why? Right? So that's the spectrum of perspectives that we have related to this. So when we think about library materials specifically, one, I would caution about getting to a process that becomes time intensive, because if we have to apply that to all 12,000 books, you're probably not going to buy too many books that year. So that is something that I think everybody, whether it's policymakers or our citizenry, need to think about, is that, and I remind people that the library is a place of choice, right? So if you're a parent, you're concerned about, certain books, you can talk to your kids about that. We also have to make sure that we don't develop access procedures that in fact take away kids' constitutional rights to access books, because the courts have been pretty clear about that too. So once the report comes out and you all want to have a discussion as a board, we are happy to be here as part of that. We can have our library media team and maybe even library media specialists who are out there implementing this on a daily basis, be present for that discussion. We're happy to engage with that.
Yeah, I certainly don't. And I really, really, really appreciate this discussion. And I certainly don't want to take all the time that we spent on this back end and just move it to the front end. It wouldn't make any sense. I want to make sure we're streamlining it. It's appropriate for all situations, and trusting our media specialists, our curriculum specialists, all of our people that are involved in the selection of our books or textbooks or curriculums and things like that. I want to make sure we do that appropriately, and that the community feels comfortable with the process in itself. And that's really too where I would like I think you already talked about moving some of those standard operating procedures into regulations so that they're accessible and transparent. I think that's a great move right there, so that it's just right out there for the public to understand. I did have one question just to clarify. We're not limiting access, but when any of our students checks out a book, it's placed on Schoology. Is that correct?
What's placed on Schoology?
That they check that book out.
Parents do have access to the books their children have.
Check that
I don't know if we have a connection over to Schoology.
I believe.
I was told that by a media specialist.
We could look at that and get back to you.
Okay. So I wanted to clarify that, because I was told that every time a book is checked out, it's placed on their Schoology.
Yeah, I had not heard that before. Yeah. We can look at that.
Okay.
That may, I mean,
Appreciate
we
it.
do have some tools that are integrated with our learning management system, and could there be an automatic reporting out of that? Perhaps. I just was not aware that we had that, so we could certainly check into that.
So the pink book
Mhm.
is not available publicly.
So it's actually, I do think it is public facing. It's not called the Pink Book anymore, but it's a pretty awesome title. I get it, right? So I think I'd have to act with Mary Jo Richmond. It's on the media website, I believe. I did hear from somebody in the community that you might have to dig a little bit for it, and that's not helpful either. So that's why we felt maybe moving things towards regulation, not everything, but some key components could move towards regulation. And then maybe if we do have some SOPs that we don't have, they're all public documents. There's nothing hidden here. I'd be happy to share it with anybody. That if we do have them posted, that we post them more prominently and easier to get to. We always hear that from the public. I couldn't find it. So that might be something that we could look at as well.
Yeah, I think that would be helpful. I mean, I think, I agree, moving into regulation where people can easily search and find that
Yeah.
information would be helpful. But, also as we're working through our policy review process, looking at this document, there's no references to the regulation that governs the, the textbooks are alleged to be inappropriate, but the request to review regulations. Like there's no reference to where those regulations are.
If nothing else, 501 is going to end up needing to be conformed to the new template with things like the links that go to the regulations, the link to where the SOP lives, wherever that ends up being. This policy will get some kind of facelift. It's just whether it's a full overhaul or if it's just a piecing it into the new template.
Again, that new template is so helpful because it does offer
Yeah.
these references.
And I think it's helpful for the public. And this is why I think regulation is a place where this can be, is we often will hear somebody say, well, do you do this? And the answer is, yeah, absolutely. We do this. And here are the documents. Well, we didn't know that. Oh, yeah. You know what? You're right. Maybe we should make the good practice that we use more transparent, and regulations are certainly a way to do that. They're people that are looking for these things know that they can go to policy and or regulation for this information. So in the interest of transparency, sure, we'll be happy to push forward the good work that we do. For us, then we have to remember that once we make a course correction because of a new MSD mandate or like the accessibility law, that we go in and review those. But Steve has put in a nice process for us to kind of continue to revisit those. And I would just expect as board members that you can see these changes occurring over several regulation review committee meetings through the course of the year. And it probably wouldn't be unreasonable to expect that at least one or any of these regs could be changed in any given year based on changes in practice or context. So it's a continuous improvement process that we'd want to put in place.
Good. Again, I appreciate the conversation. Thank
Happy
you
to be
so
here.
much.
Yeah, we'll talk about curriculum all day long.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We've only got 26 more minutes. And that actually is the last item on the agenda. We do have a number of policies sitting in the hopper now waiting to get to the Board of Education. My intention is to try and bundle them in ways that make sense. So for example, when policy 300 is ready, that's going to get presented to the board at the same time as all of the policies that are being deactivated, that are getting merged into it. So they will get a packet that this is everything, and that's going to be 5 or 6 policies in one fell swoop that we're going to be, submitting to them. There are, I think I had offline said 2, there are 3 policies that remain in the 300 series, 300, 317, which is royalties and copyright, and 319, which is the AMT group. The AMT group only needs a facelift to fit the new format. That was just redone earlier this year, I believe. So that is just applying the template to it. We should, I hope, I'm looking at Ms. Nguyen, we should have the conflict of interest policy ready to propose as well on September 27th. And that would conclude the 300 series. And hopefully by then, policy 114 will have been reviewed and approved by the board, and we'll be able to start moving them to the board in a more expedited way. One thing you may want to consider is whether we need a specific designated work session of the board to just knock out policies. I can't, that's up to you all. I just share that as that's something to think about, because we are doing a lot of work here and it's bottlenecking.
Specific to our 300 series work or in general?
Well, I mean, specific to the 300 series work to catch ourselves up, but I mean,
And these policies that we've discussed that we know are gonna have to come back to us for
I mean,
tweaks or.
I mean, we're in October, if not in September, we're going to start looking at 400 series. And as I said earlier, there's a lot of them. There's 30, what did I say, 35 400 series policies. That's a lot for us to look at. We're going to continue working on it, and I just don't want that bottleneck to hit.
And there's some pretty significant policies in the 400
Correct.
series. So.
Can you put a list together of the policies that are ready?
Oh yeah, I have it.
Okay.
Yeah.
And forward that.
Yeah, oh, absolutely.
And I'll just take that to the next agenda setting meeting and see if I can't get those packaged onto a work session.
Well,
The ones that we want
my recommendation.
decisions or.
My recommendation would be to wait until 114 is done, because if we're going to change the process for how we're reviewing, going from a 3 reading to the 2 reading with the policy cover sheet or the policy analysis sheet, it may actually expedite the process just to wait a little bit until that policy is approved.
And that's August 9th.
That's on for first reading August 9th.
First
The
reading
second
August
reading
9th.
would be August 30th.
Correct.
And then the third reading would be September 13th, presuming that it doesn't come back to this committee for revisions. Yeah, for sunset, yeah. So, but I will certainly, I can
So
certainly
you provide
provide.
the list,
yeah.
we can look at getting it in the late September meeting to just
Yeah.
get these wiped off.
Yeah.
And have it done.
Yeah, realistically, the beginning of the first meeting in October, or whatever that date is, of the board would probably be the first place to really start bringing the 300 series policies forward, because hopefully by then the 114 will be approved. By then 300 will be done.
Because what is the date 300? We're proposing 300 to come to the board.
We're gonna bring it back to policy committee in September.
Okay.
September 27th.
September 27th will be 300 will come back here.
Yeah.
Okay. So it'd be October before we.
Yeah.
Okay.
So I mean, I don't sit in your agenda setting meetings, so I don't know how far ahead you're looking when you're setting the agendas. But I can definitely provide you with the list of 300 series, the status.
Because yeah, once we slip into third, fourth quarter, October.
Yeah. That's all I've got for the committee today.
Good.
I'm good.
All right, then we will adjourn. Thank you.
Sounds good. Thank you.